can see them.
So recording has started.
Okay, so let's begin then. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. We are really happy to have you today. So we wish a very interactive session if possible. So do not hesitate to comment on the chat or to raise your voice should you have any question around the principles. So today, let me welcome Alejandro Saucedo from the Institute of Ethical AI Selden and Francois Jezequel from Orange, who will present with myself, Souad Ouali, this webinar. So this work was realized under the LFAI umbrella. We work within a group called For a Trusted AI. So we are part of this group. There is another group called Tools. So there is two subgroups within the Trusted AI working group. So the tools and the principle. I will try to explain later why we split the working group in two. This work has been realized not only by Alejandro, Francois, or myself, and we also have Susan Malaika from IBM, who is kindly sharing the screen with you, the presentation with you. We also had Jeff Kao from Tencent, Sarah Luguer from Orange, Al Caroy from the Responsible Innovation Project, and Marta Ziosi, AI for People. So this is a teamwork that is presented today. The idea is not to go through the whole work that was realized so far. This is only to give you an idea of what was done. And this webinar is the first of, we believe, numerous webinars to come. The next one should be around April. So do not hesitate to join the next webinar. So as I told you, we wish a very interactive session. So my first question will be to you. Could you tell us what are the first words that come to your mind when talking about trusted AI? Or you can comment on the chat, but what are the first words that come to your mind when we talk about trusted AI? So you just have 2 or 3 minutes just to comment, and maybe you can, Suzanne, you can tell us what are the ideas coming from the people around the table.
Yes, I see some things in the chat. Oh, Alejandro says repeats. He's been too involved.
Bias data, yes.
So Jorg says bias data, and Robert says bias free,
yes,
robust.
Robert.
Yeah.
Yes, data.
And we have
reliable.
Emily. Yeah, reliable AI. We have a lot of suggestions.
Anything else coming from all of you? So we say biased, also explicable. Explicable. Consumer perspective, explicable in some domains. Okay. So far we had bias, which came several times, bias-free, robust. Bias-free, it's something we're going to explain later, but it's really interesting that you put that, Robert. It's really interesting. Bias data, reliable AI, also explicable in some domains. Consumer perspective, which is another way to consider AI, okay. Okay, you're a medical doctor, so bias is important. That's great. You're right. Transparent decisions supported by AI. Okay. Can we believe the output from the AI machine learning models? Okay, so this is the question. So let's say that you can see that in the chat, we had several answers when it comes to a trusted AI, And if I ask you what comes to your mind when talking about principles in AI, do you still say the same, or do you add something else? I see bounded risk from Robert Nagle. So inclusive, okay. When we talk about principle, you think about inclusive, okay. Other comment? I'll just confirm that when we talk about principles, you think about the same thing that when we talk about a trusted AI. Affordable for everyone, okay. Fairness, okay. So inclusive, fairness, affordable for everyone. Any other ID? I'm asking you to participate, so a little bit hard. Normally you should just listen to me, but no way, it's better that way. So affordable for everyone is the last ID we had. So it's quite funny because you will see that we did not really get to exactly the same IDs, but I think that you will find behind the principle some elements behind your IDs. What I wanted to show you by asking you, there's two questions about trust and principles, is it was about to show you that having common principles is not so easy. I have to tell you that when we opened the working group called for a trusted AI, we had this discussion with the people around the group. Some of us thought that there was no need to discuss principle, that we should go directly to the tools. Some others thought that, of course, there is principles, but we weren't sure that everyone shared the same definition, the same level of priority, and we were unsure that the principle will apply the same in any part of the world. So this is why we decided to split the group in two, one dedicated to the tools, the other one dedicated to the principles. And this is today the presentation of what we've done so far. Because depending finally where you live, even if the principles are shared, the concepts are not always the same. And the way they are applied or prioritized may be really different. So I see that one of you, after affordable for everyone, said a background question. For me, AI is not only machine learning sub-symbolic, but also GOFA. Is this the same point of view you have, or you are working only in the machine learning perspective? Can you explain GOFA? I don't know what is GOFA.
I think it's good old-fashioned AI. Yeah.
Good old-fashioned AI. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's great. So no, it's not only to answer to a question. It's not only about machine learning. It's much more wider than that.
Definitely. Okay.
So let me check. We have gold old-fashioned symbolic AI. Okay, it's not only that. Alejandro, you can comment. Maybe you answered, so maybe you can share with everyone.
Yeah, sure. So I was just mentioning that certainly it's broader. It doesn't encompass only good old-fashioned AI, but also the operational processes, the individuals, the humans, including the touch points, as well as the underlying infrastructure required to make not just the machine learning algorithms, but the whole solutions. So we will cover that in a bit more detail during the principles. I think the gap that it addresses is the much more pragmatic and practitioner, open source type oriented.
Yes, exactly. Just wanted to know, before we go more deeply about the principles, any idea why the principles are significantly important? I told you that at the beginning within the Trusted AI working group, we disagreed about the fact that we needed to share the principle. Lots of people were thinking we have open project within the LFAI, let's go directly to tools. others were thinking, no, it's not possible. So you had this idea that AI is not only about machine learning, it's much more wider, as Alejandro told you. So any idea why we should consider the principle today? Do not hesitate again to comment on the chat as well. We try to do interactive as much as we can remotely. Sorry, you have to wait a little bit for the people to write, but so why are the principles important in AI? What could you say about that?
And maybe since
there is one question. How does your work compare, intersect with what has been published by the Union, by the European Union? I will tell you later with the group. So Emily says to guide our action. Sorry, Francois, you wanted to comment.
No, this is a very relevant from the comment from Emily, and the proposal from Emily is very relevant. Yes, I think it's exactly what we felt when we began to work on this principle. We need really to have something to structure our work, something like a backbone. So I love this idea of to have a guide, to gain trust.
Yes, and there is and there is other ideas coming. So to guide your action, artificial intelligence says, ALCA in the following definition refers to and imply any flavor and use or artificial intelligence or a derivative of artificial intelligence, including but not limited to software or hardware, simple or complex systems that include machine learning, deep learning that are integrated with other adjacent technology like computer vision, etc. Arvind says why the principles are important. He says, set the baseline. Robert said to gain trust. Without trust, there will not be societal acceptance. Really interesting, this idea, Robert, because it's something that is really important that we have to consider if we want to ensure the growth of AI. So any other idea? So, okay, I see that we're going to stay on to guide our action and to gain trust. Okay, so you can go to the next slide, Susan. So you can click again because there is the answer. So, okay. So now I'm going to go to the 8 principles we decided on. I have to tell you a small story. So you can go to the next slide, Suzanne. So you see here the 8 LFI principle for a trusted AI. We have this acronym called RREPEATS that was found by Alejandro, I think, but we discussed a lot together. You have to know a small story. At the beginning, Suzanne suggested a strip, like Meryl Streep. And I thought that it was a great idea, but some of us, unfortunately, were too young to identify Meryl Streep as a famous American actress. So I would be really happy to have strips, but we finally decided for RREPEATS. It's an easy acronym for reproducibility, robustness, equitability, privacy, explainability, accountability, transparency, and security. So this is the 8 principles we decided together. You see a cycle in this slide because you have to understand that the principles are of equal importance and value. There is no principle that is of higher priority than another, and the principles are related to each other, meaning in fact that you can't consider one principle in itself. They are all working together in order to ensure trust in AI. We had numerous debates about the principle. Some were thinking that we needed maybe 3 or 5 principles. Others were thinking that we needed more. Finally, what we've done so far when working together was to define all the area around the artificial intelligence where we wanted, let's say, to have more trust and let's say some management of the tools of the machine learning of the artificial intelligence. These principles were not easy to discuss. In fact, before we came to the definition that Alejandro will present later, we had numerous discussions. We disagreed. We did not have the same concept behind all these principles. So what you see here, it seems really easy now. It's done. It's repeats. Okay, that's great. But in fact, when we discussed, it wasn't so easy. It's a compromise between, let's say, all parts of the world, because we represent several parts of the world. So you have Chinese people, you have American people, European people. Everyone had his own idea around the principle and what was behind it. To cover everything, we discussed a lot, and we came with this principle. What was shared is that the principles were of high value and that we needed in the artificial intelligence area, considered as a very wide domain, and not only machine learning again. We needed the principle. And Francois will now explain to you our conviction regarding the importance of the principle in the perspective of a trusted AI. Suzanne, you can go to the next slide, I think, for Francois to explain our conviction. Francois, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Souad. So yes, as we mentioned, and as we have seen in the chat, for instance, when it comes to medicine, we see that if you are using a system in AI, for instance, to recognize some shapes, some forms, it's important to trust the system. So it's really a basis of our work in the area of open source, but and more generally in the Linux Foundation artificial intelligence. We need and we want to encourage trust when we develop AI system. This is a kind of superior mission. Then we try to make these principles understandable for everyone and also shared, as explained by Souad, whatever the place you live, whatever your culture. So it's really something which cross all domains, all religions, all moral values, all ethics approaches. So it's really the goal we had together when we defined this principle. And finally, we try to keep them as simple as possible, because the challenge behind the principles is their application. So we have to implement them, and we want to make them adopted at the end of the day. So that's the reason why they have to be simple enough to understand for everyone. You will see that in addition of this webinar, we will share with you a document, a reference document that describes the principles, their definitions, and also the next step. So we encourage, of course, to read it, not today, but after this webinar. Souad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Francois. Suzanne, you can go to the next slide. You will see in the presentation that we have put the definition for the 8 principles. Next slide, sorry, Suzanne. We'll come back to this one. So you will see that going through the presentation, you will have the 8 principles, the definition for the 8 principles, but for the sake of time and interactivity, we will just mention some principles to illustrate the work that has been completed, and we will provide background for the definition. We have chosen 4 principles, 2 that seem relatively easy to understand, which are explainability and transparency, and 2 that are less obvious and more complex, equitability and accountability. Maybe Suzanne, you can go to the slide before reproducibility if it's possible. Thank you. So as I told you, the idea is not to, let's say, be boring and give you a complete view of what we've done so far. As Francois mentioned, there is a complete document about the principle that you can, of course, consult. Should you have any question, we have a Slack, we have a blog, so do not hesitate after you've let's say completed this webinar and let's say look at the document to come back to us should you have any question. About explainability, transparency, equitability, and accountability, I will leave the floor to Alejandro, who will give you some definition and concrete examples. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Souad. And maybe if we start on the equitability, which is the next slide after this one. So as Souad mentioned, what I will do is give you a brief of an intuition of the definition as opposed to the full one that you can find on the website, and also to give you an example. One of the things that I do want to emphasize is that, as Francois mentioned, ultimately the principles are basically just that high-level northern stars that provide a direction for open source projects, individuals, contributors, and in the sense communities and users to know what is required to be achieved, the direction to go towards. Ultimately, from that, it goes into further granularity around the potential tools, approaches, and best practices that then can be adopted in order to achieve those higher level principles. In the context of equitability, this often comes in the word or in the wording of something along the lines of fairness, right? So we chose equitability as we felt from the definition, it encompassed a broader overarching umbrella of what is required in order to make sure that there is an appropriate, in this case, distribution on the decisions that AI systems and the the interacting parties would result. This is important because for equitability, it's not just about the tool, but it's about also the process and the people. Ultimately, in order for a solution to have a ability to account for a diverse group, the team or group developing must have that perspective as well, right? So from that perspective, it is ensuring that that is taken into consideration up front. One of the examples that you tend to see in the concept of fairness tends to be use cases like credit risk classification by AI systems. So perhaps if you have an insurance process that is currently done by a domain expert, you may want to introduce an AI system to provide some automation that ultimately would reduce the costs of an organization, perhaps from an open source tool or a system or process adopted using an open source tool. From that perspective, it is important to ensure primarily 2 things. The first one is that the data sets, the models, and the processes have the right, and that's a very complex word to use, but the proportionately required touch points and processes to ensure that the right domain experts are at each relevant stage. In this case, you can see that for a model that perhaps may be trained, you could have a particular accuracy or model performance, but also you may have further nuanced metrics like precision, recall, specificity, or other more specialized tools and approaches that you can use to be able to understand fairness metrics like disparate results, etc., etc. Now, that is kind of like an intuition. But it doesn't, of course, end there. There is a very broad set of tools and approaches that can be adopted. And the objective is, again, as we've mentioned, to ensure that there is this Northern Star for the relevant projects to be able to adopt and guide, and to do that mapping of seeing what are the features and priorities that go with those higher level. So I guess with that, yeah, I'll pause. I don't know if Souad, if you want me to go through all of them and then you can explain the background for each, or you're happy for me to sort of pass it. What do you think would be best if I just go through all of them?
No, I'm just going to explain about equitability because we had a question around biases. So just for this one, I'm just going to give an answer to someone told us bias at the beginning. And I think he said he was a doctor. So bias was something that he was really aware of. So let me tell you, behind equitability, we had this discussion about biases. So what we concluded is that biases are part of the humankind. It can't be avoided. Someone who tells you that he hasn't got any bias is a liar. Of course, everyone has biases. Everyone has biases. Life is full of biases. And what we need is to be aware of that. And sometimes we have also to consider that biases are also useful for the AI progress. It can help the machine to learn. But we need to be aware of them and put in place systems that will avoid harming people even inadvertently. It means that, in fact, the biases in themselves are not really dangerous or not so dangerous, but they can cause harm. And it means that behind this principle, what we need to identify is the bias harming people or which may harm people to prevent it. And equitability, if we want to ensure the fact that we don't want the AI or any bias present in the AI to harm people, we should consider equitability during the whole AI life cycle. The idea is not so much to identify biases and put an end to all, because to be honest, it's almost impossible. But the idea is to identify which bias could cause harm to the public and put an end not only to the bias, but also to the consequences. I think that maybe, Alejandro, you can go and explain the second principle, which is accountability, because you will see that accountability is really connected to equitability.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think it's a great segue as a next one. So ultimately, when it comes to the principles, and it was already emphasized that they're very much interconnected. One key, as with the others, is the principle of accountability. We will also see after this that we actually differentiate between equitability and explainability, as once again, they are related, but still can be used, well, approached as separate components. In regards to accountability, this ultimately introduces the ability to understand how the responsibility structure is diversified across not just the AI systems, but also the operators of those AI systems throughout its entire end-to-end life cycle. Of course, the most popular and trendy example that they tend to put in this case is the self-driving car example of, in the case that a self-driving car has an accident, where does that sort of trace back in regards to the accountability structure? Now, from that perspective, the reason why this is an important, again, principle or Northern Star is because it is important to not just be able to identify what are the processes that would map from the human operational processes to the now potentially semi or fully automated processes, but also to be able to make reasonable or responsible calls when deciding what systems may actually be using AI versus others that actually should not. Ultimately, there is a lot of value with introduction of this type of systems to reduce costs or increase profitability, but there is a trade-off on making sure that you're able to have the right tools that are proportionate, as Souad mentioned, to the risk that it can have to other humans, right? And these accountability frameworks would have to go from both a top level and a bottom-up perspective. From an organizational perspective, it's not just a responsibility of the individuals, but also the processes that the teams, the departments, the cross organizations, the industries, and more specifically when it comes to open source projects, the interactions and touch points, particularly both when it comes to the features themselves or the development, identifying what would be the right ways of performing and introducing best practices. So that's basically the context and one example. So I'll pass it back to you, Souad, so you can give a bit of the background.
Just quickly about accountability. Let's say it clearly. Accountability means responsibility. Being responsible for what was done. So AI and the people behind the AI can answer for it, explain it, and in the end, master or manage it. It's really important. We know that some people are afraid of what is, let's say, considered as liability, but it's quite normal to be able to answer for what was done. You can't say to people, I wasn't aware. Accountability is really important. It goes with equitability. It doesn't work if it's not related to other principles. It's not being liable for being liable. It's being responsible, within a set of other principles, so that at the end, we know how it works, what are eventually the bias behind that, and you answer for what was done, either good or evil, finally. There is two other principles that you can quickly maybe describe, Alejandro. I think it's about transparency. I think you haven't talked about that, and explainability, which are much more easier, I think, just to give quickly the definition of both.
Okay, yeah, I'll mention both and then I'll pass it back. So with transparency, this is encompassing the requirement for being able to ultimately provide a intuition that is, again, like everything else, proportionate to the required contexts when it comes to either users or operators of that AI system, whether it is technology experts or domain experts. It is important to ensure that there is not just an understanding, but also an awareness of what is this AI technology, AI agent, the outcomes, the data that is involved, the collection, the usage. And from that perspective, there is going to be different pluses and minuses, depending on whether the tool is used more on like a B2B or B2C type of context. But ultimately, it encompasses the ability to open up on what is actually inside. So that's on transparency. Now, I think a couple of slides back, we actually have explainability. So maybe we can go back to that one. And this, I'm sure you've heard of it a lot of times. It ultimately is what allows you to open up the black box, the model that is obscure, that you may not know what is inside. But it's also not just about the model itself, but it's also about the data. It's also about the process. It's being able to interpret, to explain, and to then be able to convey why, what, and how is the AI operation or the project or the code coming up into a respective conclusion. Again, like everything else, explainability will have to, and the red tape involved, the processes, the tools will have to be proportionate. You're not going to have to require the same level of explainability for a prototype that you're testing on your laptop versus a model that is deployed across thousands of people with impacts that could go beyond generation. So that's basically the context of this too. So I think with that, yeah, I'll pass it back to you. So
yeah, and beyond the definition, in fact, you see that explainability and transparency works really well together. Explainability is about, let's say, how the AI works. Of course, it's also connected to transparency. Transparency is the idea to easily understand how AI works and for what purpose. And also something which is really important, which goes with the biases, in fact. Normally, AI should be easily understandable by people, by people with varying degrees of expertise. So you don't need to be an engineer to understand AI. You just have, let's say, some common principles, let's say, some common knowledge that should be shared within the society so that whoever you are, you can understand the AI. Because something we know is certainly less feared and creates less friction. We really think that transparency and explainability are important to avoid ignorance, because ignorance means conflicts. And if we know how AI is made, how it works, and why decisions are taken, then we do trust more AI. We better understand it, and it's easier to answer to any opposition to AI by focusing on how to change and enhance AI. This is really key if we want to ensure the growth of AI. Ensure trust in AI is really something that is really important, because trust is the basis of any human activity. It's the foundation for healthy human relationships, and without trust, little can be accomplished. Achieving shared goals is more difficult. To provide trust in AI, the challenge is to include ways of analyzing what is good and safe and what is evil and unsafe. And I would like also to emphasize something else. I am convinced that AI is just another tool that human beings shape to suit their needs. It's not evil or good in itself, it's just a tool. So we need it and we shape it to suit our needs in our world. And it's just a tool. It's the same as when the knife was first made. A knife can kill. It's awful because it can kill, but it also can cut vegetables and be used to build. My conviction personally is that the evil is not in the tool in itself. It's always behind the one using the tool. The idea behind the principle is to try to manage a little bit this tool. Someone asked us in the chat the comparison with the European Union. So our work was based on the principle delivered by several, let's say, national and pan-national organizations, including the European Union. So if you look at the principle we discussed about today, you will see that there is quite common grounds with the one existing in Europe, in US as well, and even in China. And there was a question, if I remember correctly, in the chat that I want to understand, that I want to answer to. Someone said, what is your hope to drive real change against the huge commercially backed model, such as GPT-3? Do you expect governments to regulate AI? So to answer your question, because this is my conviction, I told you, for me, AI is a tool. Do we need regulation? I was in my background, I was a previous lawyer. I'm not really fond of regulation, to be honest, because I really do believe that we have enough laws to master and to frame the AI. We don't need more regulation. What we need is to see the existing regulation applied, and today it's not the case, to be honest. What we want to achieve, and I will call for volunteer before leaving the floor to Francois to conclude and go to the Q&A session. Sorry. What I really believe is that if you want a trusted AI, you need to use the principle we agreed upon during the whole life cycle of AI. And I'm calling today for volunteers to participate, of course, to our principal working group, but also to give us some use cases or use our principle in some of your projects in order for this principle to become a requirement, a basis for any LFAI project, any project which is not even in the LFAI, but let's say that principle should become a basis for any sensible project, so that if in a project it is not applied, the project is not serious. This is what we expect, in fact. We think that it should be possible. And personally, I think that you can't have, let's say, a trusted AI if you don't apply the principle, not only during the whole life cycle of AI, but also when machine learns to other machines. It should be in the basis of their software, if I could say that. And it should be reviewed regularly, because if you don't review them, it's not going to work. And remember that, let's say, principle, which is tightly connected to ethics. Ethics is not the law. Ethics is moral value. It can change in time. And it's really difficult, let's say, to have machine learning that kind of stuff. Moral value is really human today. Maybe it's going to be something else. Before we conclude, we still have time for the Q&A question. So we had question I tried to answer. Maybe we can now go to the question and answer. Sorry, Susan, I didn't tell you to go directly to the conclusion. Sorry for that. But we can go back. We can go directly to the Q&A. So any question around this webinar? Any comment you wish to share? You see in the presentation the references and resources we use, so you will see that the ethic guidelines for trustworthy AI from the European Commission was used, of course, but we have many sources. So feel free to comment, tell us what you think. Did you learn something today? Was it interesting? Do you have any question other than the one I already answered?
Maybe Souad also speaking, maybe a quick comment if I may. So I see that in the chat that Robert Alexander is ready to join the LFAI. Was his comments.
Great.
Very relevant comments. So Robert, you are more than welcome to participate. And just to let you know the spirit and the mindset we have in this area, under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation, it's really first, we're citizen of the world. I'm not belonging to a company. I want to put together this principle and try to not change the world by myself, but I think that together with this community effect, which is the basis of the Linux Foundation, we can move piece by pieces something. And when you're speaking about GPT-3, yes, you know, for me, it's like the myth of Frankenstein. It's a monster, and maybe we'll not control it at the end. It's really frightening. So we have not to fight that, but we have to build something beside this word, which will be at the same time for trust and for inclusivity. It's not that easy. It's a real challenge, but I think we can spend time around that. And another comment is really about the fact that a few months ago, as a member of the board of the LFI, I proposed to, given the pandemic situation, I proposed to start to address the verticals, and especially the health vertical. And I think we have together a responsibility, a duty to bring together some elements, some bricks that can help the AI to become more trusted, especially on the health domain, which is not a crucial domain, it's a vital domain for everyone. So we can think about that, and you are once again more than welcome to share your ideas, to participate. It will be a pleasure to welcome you.
So any question? I think that the first one is always the hardest one. Any question? So here you see the contributors to the Principles Working Group. You want to share comments or questions on this webinar?
I just wanted to say that I participated in the early stage, and it's really amazing to see how far you got.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does it mean that you want to participate again?
It's hard.
If you have time, of course.
With my own company now, on startup, it's really hard.
But we need startups. We need startup on board also. Offer.
Yeah. So I guess that if there is no more questions.
Souad, this is Alka. I just wanted to kind of plug in. Thank you for walking through this discussion and walking through these principles. I just wanted to also invite people to participate, because it's the diversity of thought, representation that's very much needed. I know that there was a question about inclusion before. What people forget is to include, people have to show up. And so really, you know, as Souad, you mentioned, you know, your view on regulations, there are other views on regulations as well. Exactly. And what we, you know, as in addition to how existing laws can be applied, sometimes gaps can be filled or have to be filled. And so what I've really enjoyed in this committee is that people of different opinions and ideas have come together, and companies with different business models have come together to come up with a set of principles. But this set of principles only mean anything if we apply it. And for that, we need a community. We need people to come and apply it. And there might need to be updates in regulations. There might need to be refinement to how explainability is actually applied in certain use cases. So we really, really invite people to show up, to start questioning these ideas that's being proposed here, you know, provide examples to it. So I think today is really meant to say, this is as far as this team wanted to go to define and think about it, but it's really the participation of the Linux Foundation and the community, or even a larger community, including in participation in principles, that will make it real. Otherwise, these are just ideas on paper. So we really, really want you to engage. And if you don't show up, you know, it's going to be shaped by the people who do.
Yeah, exactly. The principle have no meaning if it's not applied to real projects. So if you have a project, already one that you consider, and you want to, let's say, inject some principles in it, we would be really happy to help you doing so. It will be great, because I think that it will work only if the community is involved. And maybe, Francois, we can mention that we will have a next webinar. Susan, I don't remember the date. It's in April, but I don't remember the exact date.
Maybe we can put the link on a chat as well.
Yeah, exactly. So
I'm sharing it here. Can you see it? This webinar is one of several. April 21st.
21st April, yeah. April 21st. So it will be more about shared experience around principles in AI. So I will invite you to join, of course, this webinar, and also come to us with your project, get involved in the community, so that we can go further and make this principle a reality, whatever the business model are. And of course, as Alka told you, I have my opinion around regulation, I have my opinion around principles, but we discussed this is a teamwork, meaning that we compromised, as everything in the world is. When we compromise, it's the basis of a human being relationship. And I will leave the floor to Francois to conclude, maybe, but I wanted to thank you all for joining this webinar. Francois and Alejandro, if you want to say some word of conclusion before we leave.
Maybe a few a simple word. The fact that this committee was led and animated by 3 women, Souad, Susan, and Alka mainly. So I would say women will change the world at the end. This is a demonstration.
You forgot Alejandro.
Mainly, I said mainly. No, everyone. It's a very balanced group. So it's a pleasure to work on this group. And once again, we welcome you to participate, because it's something we can transform. This is one of our convictions. We can transform and we can act together on this topic, on this matter. AI in the open source world, and as you know, open source, the proportion of open source in development today is more and more important, and so this is a concern for all of us. We have to manage and control that, once again, in a trusted and AI manners. Do not repeat it.
Alejandro, you want a final word of conclusion before we stop?
Yeah, I think one thing that I do want to emphasize is I am quite excited that about this initiative, primarily as this launch of the principles is just the beginning of a momentum that has quite a lot of potential. The reason why is primarily because it's coming from an organization that, like the Linux Foundation, which ultimately is an advocate for open source, and not just open source, but largely the core foundational infrastructure for a lot of our day-to-day lives. So ensuring that we are not just reaching this with what often people say, such as privacy by design, but we are approaching it as principles by design. So we're ensuring that these principles are adopted from the core foundations that will really be building the society of the future. So I'm very much excited, and that's why we are repeating so much that we want further volunteers to help advocate and join further this initiative. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we need more people. So let me just thank you. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Francois, Thank you also, Suzanne. You were of great help as usual. Thanks to all the participants for having registered. I hope that this webinar was useful for you and that you will join us. So thanks a lot and have a nice day or evening, depending on the zone and the region where you are. So thank you and bye-bye.
François.
Thank you
Bye
all.
bye.
Thanks,
Have a good
bye-bye.
week.